The White House press briefing room was packed. The air was thick with anticipation, reporters murmuring among themselves, eyes darting toward the podium where Karoline Leavitt, the youngest press secretary in American history, would soon appear. Under President Donald Trump's second administration, the political climate had become more intense than ever. The country was split between fierce loyalty and vehement opposition, and no place embodied that tension more than these daily press briefings. Among the gathered journalists was Michael Reynolds, a senior correspondent for a major news network, well known for his aggressive questioning and openly atheist stance. He had made headlines in the past for his relentless criticism of religion's role in American politics, frequently targeting conservative figures who spoke about their faith. And today he was here with a mission to challenge Karoline Leavitt in a way that would force her into a corner. The door at the side of the room swung open, and in walked Karoline. Poised, confident, and impeccably dressed, she carried herself with the self-assurance of someone who had weathered countless media storms. She stepped up to the podium, set down her notes, and adjusted the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, flashing a quick smile. "Let's get started." One by one, journalists fired their questions, some routine, some laced with the usual skepticism toward the administration's policies. Karoline handled them all with practiced ease. But then, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Michael Reynolds stood. His voice carried over the murmur of the room. "Madam Press Secretary," he said, his tone deliberately challenging. "The president recently spoke about the role of faith in America, claiming that this nation was built on a belief in God. Given that millions of Americans, including many of us in this room, do not subscribe to any religious beliefs, do you think it's appropriate for the White House to endorse such a divisive narrative?" The room fell silent. Some reporters shifted in their seats, sensing the weight of the question. Others smirked, knowing Reynolds had set a trap. Any misstep from Karoline could turn into a media frenzy within minutes. She didn't blink. With a measured breath, Karoline tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question carefully. Then she leaned toward the microphone. "What I think is that America was founded on certain unshakable principles: freedom, justice, and the right of every individual to believe or not believe as they choose. And while our founding fathers may have drawn inspiration from their faith, they also built this nation on the promise that no one would be forced to conform to any one belief system." A few heads nodded in approval, but Reynolds wasn't done. "Then tell me," he pressed, his voice sharper now, "if faith is optional, why does this administration continue to speak as if belief in God is a prerequisite for patriotism? Isn't that an insult to Americans who see no need for religion in their lives?" Karoline's lips curved into a knowing smile. "That's an interesting interpretation," she said, "but it's also an incomplete one. See, faith, whether in God, in humanity, or in the pursuit of truth, is what has driven this country forward. But tell me, Mr. Reynolds, if faith is unnecessary, why do so many of history's greatest movements, from civil rights to abolition, begin with individuals who believed in something greater than themselves?" Reynolds opened his mouth, but before he could respond, Karoline continued. "That's not to say atheists don't contribute to America's greatness. Of course they do. But let's be honest, faith in some form has always been part of the American DNA. You don't have to believe in God, but you can't deny that this nation was built by people who did." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over the gathered reporters. For the first time, Michael Reynolds looked uncertain. He had expected the usual deflections or rehearsed political platitudes. What he had received instead was something far more difficult to argue with: historical reality. And this was only the beginning. Michael Reynolds clenched his jaw. He had faced countless political figures before, dismantled their arguments with well-researched facts, and left them scrambling for answers. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't rattled. In fact, she seemed to welcome the challenge. Leaning forward slightly, he fired back. "So, you're saying America is only great because of religious people? That's a bold statement, Ms. Leavitt. Are you implying that atheists, agnostics, and secular thinkers, people who have contributed immensely to science, art, and even governance, are somehow lesser in their role?" Karoline didn't hesitate. Not at all, she said, her voice calm but firm. In fact, the brilliance of America is that it's a place where people from all walks of life, believers and non-believers alike, can thrive. But let's not rewrite history. You mentioned science, art, and governance. Well, let's talk about those. She placed her hands on the podium, her fingers interlaced, as she continued. Most of our nation's foundational documents, including the Declaration of Independence, reference a creator. Not because the founders wanted to force religion on anyone, but because they understood that human rights don't come from governments. They are inherent, given by something greater than man. That's why no government, no king, and no politician has the right to take them away. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Some reporters took notes furiously. Others glanced at each other, sensing this was no ordinary exchange. Michael folded his arms. That argument assumes one must believe in God to uphold human rights. That's simply not true. Many of the world's greatest intellectuals, Einstein, Hawking, Sagan, argued that morality and ethics don't require religious faith. We can derive them from reason. Karoline nodded. And yet, Mr. Reynolds, let me ask you this. Where does reason come from? What is morality without an anchor? If right and wrong are simply social constructs, then who decides them? A government? A dictator? The loudest voice in the room. She paused for a beat, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she continued. The reason America has lasted as long as it has is because our morality wasn't dictated by kings or rulers. It was built on principles rooted in something unchangeable. You don't have to believe in God, but you do have to acknowledge that societies rooted in timeless moral truths, rather than shifting man-made ideologies, are the ones that endure. Reynolds shook his head, smirking slightly. That's just the classic appeal to tradition. Just because something has been around for a long time doesn't mean it's right. Slavery existed for centuries, but we rejected it. Women weren't allowed to vote, but we changed that. Society evolves. Karoline's expression darkened slightly, and she spoke with renewed intensity. You just made my point for me, Mr. Reynolds, she said. Who led the abolitionist movement? People of faith, quoting the Bible, standing against oppression. Who were the suffragettes? Many of them were Christian women who believed their rights were God-given, not granted by men. Even the civil rights movement, who stood at the forefront. Martin Luther King Jr., a pastor who preached justice straight from Scripture. The room was dead silent. Even those who had come ready to challenge Karoline found themselves captivated. She leaned back slightly and folded her arms. So tell me, Mr. Reynolds, if faith is so unnecessary, why is it that history keeps proving otherwise? For the first time, Michael Reynolds hesitated. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. He had expected a debate about church and state. He had expected a deflection or a politically safe answer. What he had gotten instead was an argument that was difficult to refute, because it was backed by reality. A tense silence stretched between them. Then, a voice from the back of the room broke the spell. Next question. The tension in the room was palpable. Journalists who had come expecting a routine press conference now found themselves watching something far more gripping. A battle of ideals between a seasoned journalist and a press secretary who refused to back down. Michael Reynolds wasn't one to be silenced easily. He had built his career on hard-hitting questions, on exposing hypocrisy and forcing politicians into corners they couldn't escape from. But today, Karoline Leavitt was proving to be an opponent unlike any other. Taking a deep breath, Reynolds adjusted his tie and tried a different approach. Ms. Leavitt, let's set history aside for a moment, he said, his voice measured. Let's talk about today. You speak of faith as a moral foundation, but look around. America is more divided than ever. Churches are closing. Young people are turning away from religion in record numbers. If faith is so essential, why is it fading? Karoline tilted her head slightly, as if she had been expecting this very question. You're right about one thing, Mr. Reynolds, she said. Faith is fading in some parts of America. But what's taking its place? She let the question hang for a moment before answering it herself. Rising crime, mental health crises, a loneliness epidemic. Young people searching for meaning in temporary pleasures instead of lasting purpose. We're replacing faith with something else. But is it making us stronger, happier, more united? Reynolds scoffed. So your argument is that without faith, society falls apart? That's incredibly simplistic. Karoline leaned forward. Not simplistic. Observational. Look at the numbers. Studies show that communities with strong faith ties tend to have lower crime rates, stronger family structures, and higher rates of charity and volunteer work. That's not an opinion. That's data. Reynolds shook his head. Correlation isn't causation. Just because religious communities have strong bonds doesn't mean religion is the reason. Maybe it's just a sense of community that people need, not faith itself. Karoline smiled. If that were true, then why aren't secular institutions replacing what's been lost? Why do countries that abandon faith completely often see a rise in totalitarianism or moral decay? You can argue that belief isn't necessary, but history says otherwise. Reynolds opened his mouth to counter, but before he could, Karoline raised her hand slightly, signaling that she wasn't finished. Let me ask you this, Mr. Reynolds, she said, her voice softer now, almost thoughtful. What do you believe in? Reynolds blinked. What? You've spent this entire exchange arguing against faith, Karoline continued. But what do you believe in? What drives you? What gives you purpose? For the first time, Reynolds looked genuinely caught off guard. He had spent years questioning others, tearing down beliefs, demanding justifications. But no one had ever turned the question on him so directly. He cleared his throat. I believe in truth, he said finally. In reason. In the ability of people to shape their own destinies without needing the crutch of religion. Karoline nodded slowly. That's a fair answer. But let me ask you one more thing. If tomorrow, everything you built disappeared, if your career ended, if your name was erased from history, would that belief be enough to sustain you? Reynolds stared at her, and for a split second, something flickered across his face. Doubt? Reflection? Before he could respond, Karoline continued, her voice calm but unwavering. You don't have to believe in God, Mr. Reynolds. That's your choice. But don't dismiss faith as a weakness. For millions of Americans, it's the thing that keeps them standing when the world tries to knock them down. It's what gives them hope when reason alone isn't enough. A hush fell over the room. Even those who didn't share Karoline's beliefs found themselves unable to dismiss the power of her words. For the first time in his career, Michael Reynolds found himself at a loss for words. The silence in the briefing room was unlike anything it had ever seen. Usually, these press conferences were filled with interruptions, reporters talking over one another, the clatter of fingers typing furiously on keyboards. But now, not a single person spoke. Michael Reynolds, a man known for his quick wit and sharp comebacks, stood frozen. His mind raced for a response, a way to regain control of the exchange. But the question Karoline Leavitt had posed lingered in his mind like an echo he couldn't silence. Could reason alone truly sustain someone when everything else crumbled? He exhaled, forcing himself back into the moment. Ms. Leavitt, he said finally, his voice quieter now. I appreciate your perspective, but I still believe faith is more of a personal preference than a societal necessity. Plenty of good people live without it. Karoline nodded. Absolutely. But let's not pretend that just because faith is personal, it isn't powerful. She took a step back from the podium, her gaze sweeping across the room as she addressed not just Reynolds, but every journalist present. And, by extension, the millions who would watch this exchange unfold on television and online. You see, America has always been a nation of faith, not just in God, but in each other, in our ideals, in the belief that this country is worth fighting for. That's why, despite all our struggles, despite all our divisions, we endure. She turned back to Reynolds. The problem today isn't that faith is disappearing. It's that we're replacing it with cynicism. We tear down, but we don't rebuild. We question everything, but we stand for nothing. And then we wonder why people feel lost. Reynolds shifted slightly, his jaw tightening. So you're saying people like me, who question things, are the problem? Karoline shook her head. No, Mr. Reynolds. Questioning is good. But what's your answer? If you strip away faith, if you remove that foundation, what do you replace it with? And more importantly, does it hold? A murmur rippled through the room. Some reporters exchanged glances, while others furiously scribbled notes. This was more than just a press conference now. It was a moment that would be played and replayed across television screens and social media for days, weeks, maybe even years. Reynolds' throat was dry. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him, waiting for his response. But for the first time in his career, he had none. Karoline, sensing his hesitation, softened her tone. "You don't have to answer now," she said gently. "But it's a question worth thinking about." She glanced around the room, as if addressing every person present. "For all of us." With that, she stepped back, folded her hands, and said, "Next question." The briefing room erupted into a frenzy. Journalists scrambled to be the first to react, cameras zoomed in, and within minutes, news networks would be cutting in with urgent headlines. Karoline Leavitt silences atheist journalist. Her response left America speechless. But inside that room, one man remained silent, lost in thought. Michael Reynolds had come to challenge the White House press secretary. Instead, she had challenged him. The press briefing ended, but its impact was only beginning. As reporters flooded out of the White House press room, some hurriedly called their producers. Others rushed to draft breaking news articles. Social media was already ablaze. Clips of Karoline Leavitt's debate with Michael Reynolds had gone viral within minutes. Hashtag Leavitt versus Reynolds was trending on X, formerly Twitter. Conservative commentators praised Karoline for standing firm in her beliefs, calling her response a masterclass in moral clarity. Liberal pundits dissected every word, some accusing her of pushing a religious agenda, while others admitted that she had handled herself with remarkable poise. But in the center of it all was Michael Reynolds. He sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, watching the replay of the press conference on his phone. The way Karoline had turned the conversation on him, forcing him to confront a question he had never truly considered. "What do I believe in?" lingered in his mind. Reynolds had always prided himself on being a man of reason. He had spent decades challenging faith, arguing that science and logic were the only things humanity needed. But for the first time, he wondered, was reason alone enough? His mind drifted back to his childhood. His grandmother had been a woman of faith, always whispering prayers under her breath, always telling him that no matter what happened, God had a plan. He had dismissed it as superstition back then, something the old generation clung to because they were afraid of death. But now, in the face of Karoline's arguments, he couldn't help but wonder, was there more to it than he had given credit for? A ding from his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. A message from his editor. "Reynolds, your rebuttal piece is due in an hour. Take her down." He sighed, staring at the screen. He had written countless takedown pieces before. This should have been easy. And yet, he hesitated. He opened his laptop and placed his fingers on the keyboard. But no words came. For the first time in his career, Michael Reynolds didn't have an argument to make. A nation reacts. Across America, the debate raged on. Some hailed Karoline Leavitt as a defender of faith, a leader who had stood her ground in the face of modern skepticism. Others criticized her, arguing that the press secretary of the United States shouldn't be engaging in religious discourse. But one thing was certain: America was listening. Churches reported an increase in attendance the following Sunday. Faith-based groups saw a surge of interest from people who had previously been indifferent. Even among skeptics, discussions were happening about morality, about purpose, about what truly holds a society together. And in a quiet apartment in Washington, D.C., a journalist who had spent his career tearing down faith found himself searching for something he had never considered before. Not just truth, but meaning.